Welp, welcome to another edition of Wrestling with RahXephon, and it's time we finally start getting into the more problematic characters of the series. Now, when I say problematic, I mean that these are characters who either are not relevant to the plot at all, basically, or are relevant to the plot but are not necessarily well written or characterized or developed. While RahXephon does have some great characters, it does consistently struggle with developing or writing about a third to half of the cast, and we're going to start getting into that. So this is not necessarily going to be a very positive video. My apologies. Most of these characters will not get their own video. They're probably all just going to be lumped together into one large abomination I'll pump out later. However, there are two exceptions to this rule, and those are the sisters Shito. And today we're going to start on the most prominent of those two, which is Haruka. Now, Haruka is one of the most puzzling, if not the most puzzling, and possibly most bungled character I've ever seen on this channel. I've seen characters that are intentionally written poorly to try and dissuade the viewer from something, and I've seen characters who I can see an honest attempt at something was made and it just kind of fell through. Haruka is neither of these, but kind of both of these at the same time, as she is simultaneously underdeveloped and yet very well defined by a very singular and very questionable trait. That sole trait that kind of defines her is her near obsession with Ayato. And I know the series frames it as love, but I'm going to explain why up until this point I've been calling it obsession and why it is kind of weird and why the writing does not work here. I'm sorry. It's always risky having a character defined by another character, and it's especially so if that character is supposed to be a main character and their motivations for being defined by another character aren't super clear or super logical. In fact, while I don't hate Haruka, I would consider her something of a disaster class in creating a main character, as she kind of fails on every front. She doesn't really do anything super significant to the plot past about episode 5. She isn't super well developed other than her one trait, or her sole defining mission, I guess. And both of those things, that her traits and her mission, is kind of winning back the love of someone whom she probably should have gotten over a decade ago, and oh yeah, is 17 in this context, which just leads to a lot of really weird, creepy scenes and questions when we really zoom out. I don't know why Haruka was written the way she is, but God is it fascinating in one of the oddest ways possible. But before we get into that, brief plot overview. And I do say brief because in spite of the fact that Haruka is a main character, she doesn't really do that much, which is really weird. Episodes 1 through 4 set her up as this kind of cool intelligence agent, although I don't think it's a good sign that Haruka's literal first appearance is one which is spying on Ayato, only helping my theory here that her relationship and interest with him are not the most healthy. She does single-handedly somehow infiltrate Tokyo Jupiter and kind of bail Ayato out. She kind of bungles it, but I don't blame her for getting overwhelmed by some kind of weird mystic alien technology she doesn't understand. And to be fair, she does successfully get out with Ayato. And this kind of sets her up as both our window into the world of RahXephon, our guide if you will, and a sort of just cool secret agent lady. However, again, past episode 4, that all basically goes out the window. As I noted a weird change in Haruka's character upon gathering B-roll for this video. After about episode 4, Haruka's character changes quite drastically. In fact, it's in this episode 4, it's at this very moment, where Haruka asks if she can keep this cat, where she permanently starts to swing away from the cool secret agent that we've got to know in the first couple episodes to a 30-something woman who has some issues pertaining to her relationship with Ayato. I mean, this scene did seem a little weird to me because her tone when asking about the cat is completely different to her tone that she's established so far up until this point. And I really do think it's kind of a subtle red flag, and the first of many when dealing with her character writing. It is from this point that this cool, independent character is essentially thrown out the window and turned into a more passive, emotional, and dependent character, which ultimately does less than she's done in the first 4 episodes. It's almost like a new person, in fact, and not for the better. It's not noticeable at first, or it's not super noticeable at first. I did think it was a little weird, but I couldn't quite parse it when I first saw the scene. Although upon rewatching, I do recognize why it sticks out to me, and it's because it's the first time we see the dependent personality that kind of consumes Haruka, and it is a harbinger of things to come. As after this point, she basically does one of three things. She will either be accompaniment in exposition scenes where Commander Kuniki or Yagamo or someone else on the Terra staff will explain something relevant to the episode, or she'll kind of just have a scene where she's kind of bonding with Ayato, I guess, but it's kind of weird because we don't really know the context quite yet, so it's kind of uncomfortable seeing her awkwardly hit on someone. Even if he was her age, it'd still be kind of weird just because of how it's handled. Or 3, if Ayato is in trouble, she might scream his name really loudly at a computer or directly at the camera. She does do more throughout the series, of course. That's just a general overalization, but those are her 3 main defaults. Now, she may or may not help pull Ayato out of the spirit dimension in episode 9, and she may or may not have helped solidify his decision to go back to Tokyo Jupiter and discover himself around episode 16. And she does go after him to some extent to try and convince him to come back, although not necessarily super healthy when we zoom out. More on that later. And she does go to Tokyo Jupiter to try and convince him to come back to Terra, although, to be honest, this doesn't actually result in anything. Ayato kind of just decides to go back on his own anyways, although she does, I guess, kind of serve as an inspiration for him to do that. I guess he misses her by this point, although, again, more on that later. Anyways, as the series starts to wrap up, Haruka accompanies everyone as they evacuate. Between the evacuation of Raikanai and the final battle, though, Haruka awkwardly stands next to Ayato, until Megumi literally yells at both of them. Wait, is that the whole point of her character? Is that the reason she's in the show? Just so she could yell at Haruka for 2 seconds to actually speak her mind for once? Have I figured it out? I hope I'm wrong, that's really sad. And now confident that her sister has kind of renounced her claim to Ayato, I guess, Haruka finally spills the beans about her feelings about Ayato to him. She basically says, yeah, I've been thinking about you for 10 years. Yeah, it's been that long. Yeah, I still feel that way. Is that weird? Probably, but yeah. And I can't tell if this speech is supposed to be her finally coming on to him, like, directly, or if it's supposed to be her, like, conceding defeat and finally moving on. I could see it going either way. However, the series clearly intends for it to be a sort of finalization of the two's romantic relationship, which is weird for reasons we'll get into later. But in relation to the plot summary, in response, Ayato basically goes, well, I guess I like older women now, and then they hug, and then they kiss, and then they kind of just part ways as Ayato stays to fight the Mu and Haruka evacuates. And look, I'm not going to say the scene is horribly done in a vacuum. Like, with no context, I'm pretty sure the scene looks like, you know, a pretty good generic romance scene. However, the context kind of ruins it. As, without context, this is just like a couple, like, being a couple. It's like, okay, whatever. But then you have the context of the age gap, and then you have the context of the fact she's been obsessing with this for over 10 years, and you kind of see how the writers shot themselves in the foot. Because by establishing such context, it makes it seem weirder, because again, if there was no context here, if Haruka and Ayato were like complete strangers, and they were both like 21, all the interactions in the show would feel a lot better, and they wouldn't feel as weird. Or it'd still be awkward, but I could be like, okay, it's just a weird couple, like just two people being awkward. But the context of it kind of ruins it, because it goes from 2 people being awkward to a woman obsessing over someone for 10 years, and then kind of like kidnapping him or like gaslighting him into like joining her workplace so that she can kind of hit on him some more. The context kind of ruins everything here, because it makes everything seem a little more insidious due to the fact that Haruka's been obsessing over this for 10 years. Again, if there was no context here, if this was just like 2 20-somethings like awkwardly falling in love, it'd be fine. But the fact that there is a previous relationship that is also over 10 years old and basically dead before this makes it feel more like Haruka's kind of just like gaslighting someone than someone actually forming a normal relationship. It feels artificial for this reason, and it's kind of weird to me. She escapes the last battle. She doesn't partake in it, although she does steal a plane to go see Ayato one more time in his final form. And Haruka also has this metaphysical conversation with Maya, where Maya basically says, well, I tried to love Ayato as a mother, but I guess that ship has sailed. I can't love him in any way no more. I've been rejected. So it's up to you, Haruka. Go love this guy, and go suffer with him, I think she literally says. To which Haruka says, thanks, Aunt Maya, and yeah, that's really weird when you think about that either way. Now, I know that according to lore, Haruka and Ayato are completely unrelated, like in terms of blood, because Maya was adopted by Uncle Rikto, but she's like dating her adopted nephew, which is still weird. Again, I don't know why RahXephon has like this weird inbreeding theme. For some reason, it seems like whoever was in charge of this show was kind of like really interested in that idea for some weird reason. It pops up a disturbing amount. And this may or may not inspire him to do the reset that he does, i.e. set the world on the path where he ends up with her at the beginning. There is a flashback scene at the very end of the series where they see their first meeting when they're both 14. So I guess that's not weird. And I also think it should be stated that Haruka, 14-year-old Haruka, is the girl that Ayato is always painting but can't quite remember. Because again, it is revealed that they did date in middle school and did seem to be pretty close for two 14-year-olds, although I do not consider that the foundation for a 15-year-old obsession and quote-unquote eternal love, which we'll get to now that we're done explaining Haruka's place in the plot, and probably getting to why she's the weakest link of the entire series. And it boils down to several main points. 1. Haruka's personality and motivation and actions are all unduly shaped by one character, and that is Ayato. And to be honest, he doesn't even really have any power here shaping those things. It's just her obsession with him that shapes them, really. 2. This leads to a very strong urge for her to get back with Ayato, and while this urge is very strong, I question the foundations of it, as a school crush isn't the basis of quote-unquote eternal love. 3. This is further reinforced by the fact that there's almost no effort to make her motivations more believable, as almost no real context is given. We don't really get a flashback where Ayato and her go on a picnic or something, or where they're super close and have like cute dialogue, or really do anything. There's probably like 32 seconds total of them both being 14 and like being coupled. There's no context here, so it's really weird. 4. Even with context, if context was given and was super sound somehow, her motivation still doesn't really drive her to do anything or grow. Even if the foundation was sound here, which it definitely is not, she doesn't build on top of it. 5. She does, however, allow it to make her unduly emotional. And since these emotional moments lack context and often a reasonable cause, it just makes her look kind of weaker overall. 6. The amount of time dedicated to her being on screen and not obsessing over Ayato is incredibly minuscule. I'm talking about time where she like actually does her job, or where she talks about something non-Ayato related, or just does something critical to the plot even. Her actual screen presence is very lacking, and the fact that she's emotional over Ayato for a lot of it just emphasizes a lot of her negative traits, and point to a character who's not really well defined or really in touch with themselves. And 7. Due to all of this, her character just feels kind of out of place, as it's obviously essential to the plot, but we don't necessarily know who she is as a person. She's more of a device, really, when we think about it. In a storytelling context, she's not so much a person as a thing that may or may not make things happen, but again, she doesn't even necessarily do that. So she's kind of pointless in a lot of ways, which is really weird considering she's supposed to be a main character and even a motivation for Ayato. Which doesn't work either because she's the one trying to like get back with him, and it's really creepy when we zoom out, which we'll definitely talk about. All of these points though coagulate to create one of the worst written main characters I've ever seen, not only in the context of this channel, but in a lot of things. She's one step away from telling me that she doesn't like sand, and where that character is supposed to be intentionally awkward, I don't think Haruka is. She lacks her own character, or even legitimate motivations, and so as instead of coming off as a passionate lover defying time itself and the fate of the world, she just kind of looks like a creepy, boring weirdo, which is not a compliment. It's bad enough that Ayato is 17 and she's 29, but, say he's 18, say we're not breaking any laws here, that's still kind of weird, seeing as that the entire basis on this is based off of a middle school crush that, at least to her, has been over for over a decade. It's been a while, okay? Maybe you should have gotten over this by now. Maybe you should learn to love yourself and question where you are in your life and how you're doing and not obsessing over a boy you haven't seen for 12 years. And this isn't even really Ayato's fault, because we don't get any context of the relationship, And he totally forgot about it, so it's not like he's trying to gaslight her into doing this. This is entirely her. I mean, I guess there are some arguments that people could propose saying, quote, but RahXephon does show these two bonding, or Haruka isn't insidious, she's just awkward and doesn't know how to process things. And I guess you could say that both of those are objectively true, but it's also true that neither of those make up for the horrible writing present, or the fact that the concept simply doesn't work here, because the entirety of the concept is predicated upon Haruka's horrible mental health hygiene. The entirety of Haruka's relationship with Ayato is not necessarily predicated on some strong emotional bond, but the memory of some strong emotional bond. Like, neither of these excuses given change that either. In fact, the writers kind of shot themselves in the foot again here, as if there was no context here, this wouldn't be a sticking point. If it was just two strangers meeting up and falling in love, it's like, oh, Ayato and Haruka met when they escaped Tokyo Jupiter, and they fell in love through some funny circumstances, and now they're married. That's not weird. That's just two people meeting under stressful circumstances and dating. It's weird, though, because of the context provided, because it proves that Haruka thought about this for 10 years, and then sought out Ayato specifically just so she could rescue him, I guess. I guess that's wholesome, but it also seems like there is some kind of ulterior motive here. Like, she does want him, even though she seems to know that that's not necessarily correct here, and that is kind of weird. But again, the writers don't really make an issue of this, and they kind of ignore the fact that the context provided is the reason that it's weird. In fact, I would go as far to say is that the context is the main reason this relationship doesn't work. The fact that there is context given, and the fact that Haruka is obsessed over this and has been plotting this for essentially 10 years, and the fact that Haruka hasn't gotten over this in 10 years is what makes it weird to me. And it's even weirder because the show never addresses this context in any light other than positive. It establishes it as a sort of motivation for Haruka, and it just says generic positive, she's devoted. However, it never questions if this devotion is actually obsession, and it never questions if Haruka should have moved on by now, and it never questions if 10 years is a healthy amount of time to be, on this quest, and it never questions anything from Ayato's point of view, i.e., how does he feel having been essentially kind of forced into all of this? It doesn't ask any of these important questions to process the context in any way other than generic positive, which is really weird because I don't think it should be taken as generic positive. As I've stated before, I think the context does show some kind of underlying issues with Haruka's character or mental health, and that these shouldn't be swept under the rug by some kind of just generic positive narrative, which I don't necessarily see here because I think it's obvious that something isn't necessarily right with her, and I think it's obvious that the context should be questioned here, if not to create interesting character drama of some sort, then to at least put to bed some concerns that the viewers might have. There are a lot of scenes where the romance is like, oh, generic positive, but is it really romance? Is it really generic positive when we take the context into consideration here? And to avoid, that kind of conflict, the show simply doesn't take the context into interest. It simply ignores it and uses it only to provide a motivation without actually exploring it in any way that might make us question what's actually happening here. And in this way, I think this is why it feels really artificial and creepy to me, because not only is Haruka kind of gaslighting Ayato, but the show's kind of gaslighting us into just taking this relationship at face value. There's a lot of scenes where it's like, oh, they're a couple, and that's cute, and good for them. And the show seems like it really wants you to buy into that, and it wants to fool you into believing that there's no weird context here by simply ignoring it. And I think the fact that the show does this is what makes me uncomfortable, because you could say, oh, Haruka's an unstable character, oh, Haruka's not learning anything, she's living in the past, and there are ways a show could handle that and make it seem like, oh, this is bad, but the show never does, and it never contextualizes anything above a surface level, and this is what makes it really weird and artificial. And it honestly just makes her look kind of weak and weird, and it makes her look unstable, and it makes me uncomfortable. As zooming out, it is really weird. Even if he was 18, the way she approaches him and hits on him or gets noticeably uncomfortable around him is very weird. If you're an adult and you think someone's attractive, just politely say it. And if, whatever happens, happens. But Haruka doesn't. She's always weird and kind of squirmy around him, and always very emotional in regards to Ayato, which is even worse for us as an audience because we are not directly informed of any previous relationship for a while. We're not indirectly informed at least till episode like 7, and that's a very small like hint. You have to kind of connect some dots there to get it by episode 7, although you can for a minute or two. But until the show really spells it out for us, it seems super weird and creepy that she gets super emotional when Ayato's in danger. Like, I remember the ice episode where Kunigi is like, uh-oh, Ayato's in trouble, and you're like, oh, Commander Kunigi, you're so cold. But some of the bridge staff, they're scared too. Kim's like, oh, this is getting tense. Megami has like a look of fear on her face. But they keep it professional. But then Haruka's just screaming at the top of her lungs, Ayato! Which, in context, I guess makes sense because she has some kind of weird attachment to him, but we're not even given that context, so until we're told that there is context here, it makes her character seem even creepier than it is, which it is creepy, I'm not going to say it's not. And none of this is balanced out by any sort of important action or even character reflection, development, or growth. Like, it is weird how stagnant Haruka is throughout the series, and it's also weird considering that there are entire characters dedicated to proving why that is a bad thing. Itsuki's entire character is basically a cautionary tale, like, hey, do something with your life, but Haruka doesn't do anything. In a show which has a character proving why that's bad, instead, again, she simply just kind of fluctuates between awkwardly hitting on Ayato, or getting kind of upset if he gets upset, or screaming his name really loudly into the camera when he's in danger. Outside of this, she barely has any character of her own, which is really bad, for a main character. Especially a character in a character-driven genre like, I don't know, romance? I guess she does do stuff, like try to dig up more about Kwan's past, but whenever she does stuff like this, it's just kind of an exposition thing to get more exposition out of the way. Futagawa could have done that, and he's Columbo and he's way better, so she doesn't really do that much. But getting back to the point, a lot of the time, the whole Haruka x Ayato thing doesn't even really feel like a couple, or two people coming close together and forming some kind of relationship. It feels less like that a lot of the time, and more like just some kind of unstable lady successfully gaslighting her victim into thinking that their relationship's totally normal and healthy, and that, don't ask questions, this isn't weird or creepy at all, or have any underlying mental health issues here. No, this is not just a creepy older lady gaslighting you, Ayato. Which it totally does feel like, by the way. And I know that may sound harsh, but look at it from Ayato's point of view. Now, this lady randomly comes into your life, she tells you that everything you know is wrong, she overloads you with information, disproving everything you've ever thought you knew, she lies to you, and then she ropes you into a war that you don't want to fight, only so that you can't end up in a concentration camp. I mean, I guess one is better than the other, but she kind of forced that decision upon you, and neither of those options are great. And then after all of this, she just kind of awkwardly hits on you from time to time, and still may or may not lie to you for quote-unquote business needs. Now, if you were in Ayato's shoes, I could understand you feeling quite uncomfortable, because those are things that I don't think they characterize a particularly healthy relationship, or at least not a conventional one. This is a lot of just circumstances which add a lot of emotional tension and confusion and just not necessarily pleasant things. I mean, it creates a lot to be uneasy about, especially again if you imagine that you're Ayato and you know literally nothing else about this world that has been foisted upon you. If you don't know any better or you don't know anything, then Haruka's kind of your lifeline here, and it's a very biased lifeline which may or may not be trying to get something else out of you. I don't think I need to explain any further how that could create some unease, or at least it kind of did for me. To be clear, I think Haruka, she's definitely dealing with something, because 12 years is way too long to fixate on someone you made out with like 7 times in middle school. It hints at some kind of super deep insecurity, or character issue, or trauma, or underlying scare, or something else that should probably be dealt with, in a more accommodating or professional manner. At the least, I would say Haruka has some kind of PTSD, either from how she was separated from Ayato, or just the whole invasion of Tokyo, or something, I don't know. but she does not seem like a healthy person. And that's not an insult to anyone with mental illness. I'm just saying that it's really weird that the show kind of holds this up as a paragon of romantic virtue, when really I think this is someone that needs to talk to someone about how they feel and their own issues, and really work on themselves in order to really feel better about life. It's kind of insulting, really, because RahXephon's going through Haruka, it's going, yeah, you don't need to fix yourself or love yourself, just find someone else to do it for you, which doesn't work because you kind of have to have your own self-esteem to love someone else or form healthy relationships with other people. It's kind of insulting to mental health, really, when you think about it, because Haruka's just kind of some weird gaslighter who gets away with it, and, you know, while a healthy person might randomly remember a prior relationship for like a moment at a time, or if something specifically relevant comes out, or maybe they're single at the moment and they're like, what if this happened? It's not something that they would normally fixate on, especially if it was over 10 years ago and it was like pretty mundane from what I can tell. But Haruka does. She fixates on it for over a decade. And it's disturbing to me that no one in the cast, and therefore the writing room, seems to take any issue with this. Like, think. Say this was real life. Say Haruka was your sister, or your mother, or your friend, or your accountant, or that person that drops off the mail. Someone in your life with some kind of meaning to you. You would probably say to them at this point, you can and you will get over this. You know, it's going to be tough, but you got to learn to love yourself. You got to learn to move on. You got to learn to live your life for you. You have to be your own person and just learn to love yourself, and someone will come into your life one day. And, you know, you would be saying that probably around day 15 after a breakup. Hell, maybe even like hour 15, depending on how serious this was. Let alone year like 12 or 15. I wrote 15 in the script. I don't know. I think it's like 12 actually in the show. But still, that's over a decade. And there's no context to make me think any other way about this. There was no establishment of a super serious relationship. I mean, they were only 14 at the time. And therefore, there's no real justification for any of her behavior other than some kind of unhealthy coping mechanism with some kind of past trauma or perhaps underlying mental condition. And again, I don't want to make light of PTSD or mental illness. It's just that the show itself seems to be, because it's writing a character who clearly has issues and rewards her basically for resolving them in a very unhealthy way. That gets us to the fact of the matter that even if Haruka's Ayato or nothing mindset did work out according to the story, it's an inherently self-destructive, creepy, and unhealthy one. And if this was real life, and someone was obsessing over Jimmy from 12th grade gym for 20 years, you're going to look at this person and you're not going to ask why they're unmarried. You're going to ask, how do I get this person the help they need? If this was real life, people would probably tell someone that they need to move on, or at least go to therapy or talk to someone or get a hobby or do something. But no one does that for Haruka, which again just seems at best ignorant on the part of the writers, or at worst downright insulting. You know, no one does anything for her other than enable her really weird fantasies and her bad mental hygiene. No one goes, hey Haruka, are you sure about this? No one calls her out. No one really has anything to say to her. Like, hey, that's kind of weird, he's 17, bro. No one says anything like that. In fact, many of them even encourage it. They're like, oh, look at you, you're going and getting yourself a man. But first of all, legally speaking, he's not. And second, you do not look at your friend gaslight someone for like 6 months and go, you know what, yeah, you're a good person. It's weird how thick Haruka lies it on as early as she does, and no one thinks it's kind of weird or creepy. Like, it's one thing, oh, you think Jimmy's cute, you get a little squeamish around him, you get a little squirmy, you get a little nervous, maybe you flub your words a little, that's fine. It's not fine, however, if the reason you get nervous is because you've been planning this moment out for 10 years, having not seen Jimmy for 12. That's pretty weird, because she hasn't got over things. And the fact that the show encourages Haruka obsessing over Ayato, and basically rewards the fact that she has decided to not do anything with her life for 10 years. I mean, she's done stuff, obviously, she has a job, but like, developmentally, or move on past trauma, or deal with it in a healthy way that emphasizes loving herself in order to love others, or, you know, just work on self-esteem or something, is very weird. And it kind of teaches a horrible lesson to the viewer as a whole. In fact, it's one of the worst writing decisions I've ever seen. not just in RahXephon, but in general. Like, creepy Haruka just doesn't work for me. I've seen mental illness firsthand, and I know that this is not something to joke around about. And I've also seen pretty well-written romance movies, and I know that this is not one of them. And it's weird because it's like they chose like the worst possible path. They could have had a story where Haruka doesn't love Ayato, maybe she's his mother or something. Or they could have had like no attachment there, or they could have just been friends. Or hell, creepy Haruka could have even worked. It could have been redeemed if one of her plot points was about finally moving on from Ayato after meeting him after like 12 years and realizing like, this just ain't gonna work, man. And that could have even made for a good story if Haruka accepted that window of opportunities closed, and maybe I was wrong to waste 10 years of my life thinking about it, and maybe I should have moved on. Could have been a great story about working through the pain of past regrets and accepting the facts of the world. Like, she could have had a talk with Elvie where Elvie says, look dude, I'm sorry, but it's how it is. And maybe talk to Professor Ricto, get some old man advice in. She could have realized how dangerous living in the past is, and then even come to accept the idea that Megami has now taken her place, which it seems the series did kind of set up, but then it backed out at the last minute of. And I do note this because it would also give Megami's character and arc some kind of meaning other than none at all. That'll get its own video. But this way, even if Haruka is still emotional and doesn't really do anything, at least she could teach us, the viewers, a good lesson about the need to move on and love oneself, and have actual character development. But no, for some reason, no one in the writer's room saw any issues with what the final product is, with her writing, her weird motivations, her odd behaviors, her lack of screen presence, her bad moral development, her poor mental hygiene, and the fact that she doesn't even really do anything. All of which are critical issues for a main character who honestly doesn't even feel very relevant to the series. I mean, let's be honest here. There's nothing Haruka's character does that Megami couldn't really have done anyways. Like, if just make Megami and Ayato both like 23, and then boom, their whole relationship could proceed as it seems like it was going to in episode 5, without the whole last minute jilt added in. I mean, Haruka's character is so developed and impactful that I am actively advocating for its removal. Honestly, it's insulting how poorly it's written. Characters like Elvie, Kim, and Megami prove that the writers could and did sometimes write well-developed and interesting female characters, but Haruka is not one of those. If I was a woman, in which I'm not, I think I'd be offended by Haruka. Offended by a character whose entire purpose is simply to fawn over some dude she met like 10 years ago, whose entire personality, motivations, character development, etc. revolves around one teenage male. I mean, it's quite backwards. And I just want to say that Haruka and Ayato's relationship and their general dynamic just make me uncomfortable for reasons that I'm sure of, like the fact he's 17, and many that I don't necessarily understand 100%, although I have like vague feelings of why. I think it boils down to just kind of how uncanny it is and how kind of like bizarrely artificial it feels. It just feels so weird to me regardless of the age. Like if they were both 23, I think it would still be weird because of other circumstances present. It feels like the writers were trying too hard to make this a sort of star-crossed lovers thing by providing all the bizarre context that makes Haruka seem creepy, without noticing that the context is kind of what torpedoes the concept in the first place. It does make it seem like they didn't really know how to write romance, or at least not when it comes to the main character. It seems like they wanted to provide Haruka some kind of motivation other than romantic attraction, but the whole point of romance is romantic attraction, so just saying that, oh, they dated 10 years ago makes it seem really creepy, because while they're trying to provide her a motivation, realistically they're just providing evidence to the viewer that this lady is kind of unstable and doesn't know how to accept loss or move on properly. All of this just makes it feel kind of artificial to me, and I don't know how to quite process that with my brain. Neither character seems artificial, it just seems like they're living in this really weird forced scenario, and it doesn't sit well with me. It makes me uneasy. It even feels like to some extent I'm kind of like reading fan fiction, I guess, even though it's not. This relationship, it just feels off, something unnatural, and that's about all I can say. And Haruka's character is just, as a whole, imparts terrible life advice, not to just young women, but to everyone in general, as she just lives in the past. And it negates the entirety of character development, of the entirety of character lessons we see in characters like Itsuki, Megami, and I'm sure there's some others. She gets away with just horrible mental hygiene. She gets away with everything and basically imparts a horrible message to the audience. She's a testament not to the idea of eternal love, but instead just terrible writing decisions and wasted potential.